McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Socialism seems to be on the minds of every politician and media pundit. But guess what? Most of them don't even know what socialism is. And by the way, just what is democratic socialism? Well, fasten your seatbelts as our co-host, Jim Falk, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, is here to help me with this. So, Jim, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you. Why don't you just tell Bob what he's supposed to say? Otherwise, you can just introduce him and let him tell us what he's going to say.
I think I'll go ahead and introduce him right now.
He's accustomed to being
we had a
told
good
what
talk
to
a
do.
few minutes ago. What he really likes to do is climb high mountains.
Yes, I know he does.
But Bob does hold the Jerome M. Fullenwider Centennial Chair in Economic Freedom and is the director of the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom at Southern Methodist University, associated with the Cox School of Business. Dr. Lawson is a co-author of the widely cited Economic Freedom of the World Annual Report, and we're going to be talking a lot about that on this program, which presents an economic freedom index for 160 countries.
Incredible stuff. Bob, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here, Dennis. Thanks.
And joining us via Skype is Lane Kenworthy. He's a professor of sociology and the Yankelovich Chair in Social Thought at the University of California, San Diego. His books coming up this fall are Social Democratic Capitalism, his new one. He's written stuff like The Good Society, 100 Things to Know, and How Big Government, or How Big Should Our Government Be, I should say. So, Lane, welcome to the program. We appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us, if you don't mind, what socialism is from your perspective, and whether or not this socialism is actually what we would define socialism as. And so democratic socialism is probably a little different, I think, but differentiate between that, would you?
Most of the people in the United States who these days are referring to democratic socialism really mean something that I would call social democracy, which consists mainly of an expansion of public, that is to say government social programs, things like paid parental leave, early education, so child care and preschool, the earned income tax credit, sickness insurance, things along this line. Socialism, for most of those who've thought about it and debated about it over the last century, refers to an economic system where the government owns a lot of the property, owns a lot of the businesses, produces a lot of the goods and services that are sold. And I don't think, apart from some people who are, for example, members of the Democratic Socialists of America, a relatively small organization. I think it's got about 50,000 members. And one of our new House of Representatives members is a member of that. Some of them probably favor an economic system with more government ownership, more government production. But most of the, for example, Democratic candidates for the presidency, even if they, like Bernie Sanders, might refer to democratic socialism, they're really talking mainly about an expansion of the welfare state.
You know, Bob, there's going to be so much discussion about this in the 2020 election. What are do you really agree with that definition of socialism, and is what we're seeing in the platforms similar to that?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think we're in agreement with the terms. Socialism means the state owns and controls the means of production, the land, the labor, and the capital. Social democracy usually means the land, labor, and capital are owned by private entrepreneurs, private landowners, property owners, and they produce products, sell those products in private markets. So I think we agree on the terms, but actually I think this binary socialism, not socialism, or social democracy, I don't know what, free market democracy, these binaries aren't very helpful. I really think it's really more of a continuum from publicness on the one hand, countries where the public sector is involved in economic and social life sometimes to a great degree.
And give us an example.
Well, I mean, you could use Sweden. Some of the examples that Lane was using, where the state is running daycare centers. The state is not just running schools; they're running education or exercise recreation centers, and the state is organizing a lot of public services. So the organizational method is taxation and then hiring people to execute, say, a daycare center. And so that's one extreme, and the more you do that, the more public you are. You can extend that into, public housing or other things if you'd like. The other extreme would be more privateness, more reliance on private owners, entrepreneurs, and business owners who provide daycares and rec centers and housing and all these other things. They provide that through markets.
And aren't we slowly really beginning to see in the United States this slide towards more of a welfare state?
Yeah, so the index that I was mentioned in the introduction is the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and the United States had always scored third on the scale, behind Hong Kong and Singapore. The United States was certainly the largest, mostly free market economy, and the U.S. has definitely slid on our scale.
Beginning when?
Beginning around 2000. So I blame George W. Bush. I work at SMU, President Bush.
Well, the Bush Center is there. What the heck? He's close by. You can blame him easily.
Yeah, I should walk over and say, hey.
Got a problem here.
Yeah. The reality is, though, the reaction to 9/11 was more spending, more regulations, capital controls. And then we also saw some what we call our property rights numbers, which were mostly borrowed from the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. And those numbers began to decline. I think it had to do with a lot of sort of security state type changes in the 2000 period. All of those things may have been good public policy. They may have been necessary to fight the war on terrorism. But the fact is, at least the way we score, that moved that elevated the public sector relative to the private sector.
So we have fallen from 3rd to 16th. What other countries have fallen?
Actually, the only other country that's fallen over this period of any note is Venezuela. So the United States fell and Venezuela fell.
That's not very good company.
That's not good company.
Hopefully we didn't fall that far. And so let me tell all my good free market conservative / libertarian friends this. And this came from my friend Jacob Hornberger, who you probably know, Bob, and he's been on our program several times. And the Future of Freedom Foundation. And he writes this to conservatives and some liberals and progressives and libertarians. He says, I'm a capitalist, not a socialist, except for my support of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public schooling, the Federal Reserve, immigration controls, the national income tax, the military-industrial complex, the welfare state, foreign aid, farm subsidies, the government-managed economy, the Postal Service, Amtrak, public works, the interstate highway system, and national parks. Now, other than that, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist. That's kind of where we are. Now, Lane, you know that we've got all these things. I'm thinking you're saying a few minutes ago that you want even more than this. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you.
How are we going to pay for it?
We're going to get to how we pay for it in a minute. I'm going to read your list, Lane, if I may. You mentioned a couple of them. Here's what your book says. You want universal health insurance, 1 year paid parental leave, universal early education, an increase in the child tax credit, sickness insurance, eased eligibility criteria for unemployment insurance, wage insurance, supplemental defined contribution pension plans with automatic enrollment, extensive personalized job search and retraining support, government as the employer of last resort, minimum wage increased modestly and indexed to prices, and EITC extended farther up the income ladder and indexed to the average compensation or GDP per capita, social assistance with a higher benefit level, reduced incarceration of low-level drug offenders, affirmative action shifted to focus on family background rather than race, expanded government investment in infrastructure and public spaces, and an increase in paid holidays and vacation time. Is that about it, Lane?
Yes, that's right.
Now, would you mind telling us why you would want to add all of that onto what we already have, which is what I consider a welfare warfare state already?
Well, the deep underlying reason is that we can see in most existing democratic countries, at least in history, that there's a tendency as nations grow richer to want to and be able to spend more money on insurance of various kinds, policies or programs that protect us against loss. As humans, we're pretty risk or loss averse. And so you can see even in the United States, which is a laggard compared to, for example, Sweden or Denmark or many of the nations in continental Europe or even Canada, even here, we spend about 25% of our GDP more now than we did around a century ago, and much of that is in these types of public social programs. And it's for exactly that reason, in addition to the fact that as we get richer, we tend to care more about fairness, that is about opportunity for formerly excluded groups, people with various disadvantages. So there's nothing particularly surprising about this. And why that particular list, that has to do with the fact that most of these programs either exist here, but don't do as much as they could, or don't exist here, but do exist in other countries. And we can tell that they do an effective job, and for the most part do so without breaking the bank.
Okay,
So this is mainly.
I like that explanation, yes.
Question,
Bob,
yeah.
your
How
thoughts?
do we pay for it?
Well, you know, if we could turn the whole world into Sweden tomorrow, I probably would snap my fingers and do it. It's a pretty nice place. I've been there. It's a pleasant place. Beer is expensive. Everything's expensive because the taxes are very high. But in return for those taxes, the Swedish citizens get a lot of goods and services provided to them by the state. One of the differences is that the Swedes don't really redistribute much. Most of the Swedish people are paying taxes to the Swedish government, and then the Swedish government returns to the very same taxpayers these daycare centers and these various things, that the insurance policies and so forth. When we talk about that in the United States, most welfare, our welfare state is redistribution. We're going to take money from some people to give it to others. So there's really a qualitative difference between the way in which the welfare state has evolved in the United States, where it really is a redistributive welfare state, whereas Swedish one, which is more of a government provider of services. And people don't mind governments too much when they give them back value. If you take money from me, but you give me a swimming pool that my kids can swim in, I may prefer to have the money, but at least I got a swimming pool. But the worst, in America, what happens is people take money. One of the reasons we have a more resistant situation to welfare in the U.S. is taxes get taken from people, and the people don't get the money back in a swimming pool. They get it gets sent to another state or another community that, well, for better or worse, they don't care as much about.
Robin Hood.
Yeah.
So what percentage of tax do people pay in Sweden on average?
Swedish tax rates it's about a third more. So in terms of overall government spending, the United States is about 30%. They're in the neighborhood of 45%. They're about a little over a third higher. So it's 10%, 15% of GDP. It's not full-out socialism by any stretch, but it would require a massive increase in the tax take in this country.
Well, as a matter of fact, they were headed down that socialism path until the early 1990s, in which they found they couldn't afford it. What did they do then, Bob? How did they change things in Sweden?
Well, yeah, so Sweden has moved a little bit in the direction of private markets. On that sort of sliding scale from publicness to privateness, Sweden's actually moved a little bit up, as has Denmark and to a certain extent Norway and Finland. Southern Europe, not so much, but Northern Europe has actually moved more in the direction of the United States. While maybe the United States is moving more in the direction of
Yeah, I was
Northern
going to say
Europe.
that may be the other way
It's been some
around.
convergence in terms of the tax rates and the policies.
Yeah, well, Sweden their federal debt went from 80% of GDP to 40% now. What is the GDP to debt ratio in the United States right now?
I'm not 100% sure on this, but thanks for putting me on the spot. I think it's about 100%. We're hitting 100%.
We're getting very close.
And that's when you start, at least some economists think, that you start running up to 100%, you start to run into trouble. Now the U.S. is special because the U.S. is the world's largest economy, we're the reserve currency. We might be able to go to 120% before we really run into some real trouble. Who knows? We actually don't know. We're kind of in uncharted territory. But other countries that have hit the levels that we're now at have run into some type of financial or monetary crisis, or it almost always results in some sort of crisis event. We might be able to escape that for another few 10 points or 20 points of GDP.
You know, Dennis, what I find so fascinating right now is how quickly the discussion has changed. And Peggy Noonan, just a few days ago, wrote in her Wall Street Journal column, Declarations, "The new lefties are a minority in the House, but have become the face of the party, its brand." And where do you think this is coming from? Is it the impact on young people of the 2008 Great Recession, or something else?
If you'll permit me a small plug for a book I've got coming out in July, it's called Socialism Sucks. It's not an academic press book, as you might be able to tell from the title, but one of the things we did for that book is we went to Chicago last summer to attend the Socialism Conference. It bills itself as the largest collection of socialists in the United States. And when we arrived, we thought we were going to see a lot of Che Guevara t-shirts, and we did see a couple, but Mostly I ran into young people, college-age students mostly, or just out of college, who were just concerned about the world we live in. And I actually, I'm kind of a libertarian, I shared some of these concerns. I saw people who were concerned about abortion. They were concerned about immigrant rights. They were concerned about imprisoning the prison population and things like that.
And climate change, I'm sure.
And climate change. And I share some of these concerns. For whatever reason, though, they've latched on to this word socialism, which they think is the thing that's going to, it's kind of weird. I'm really not sure what socialism, has to do with abortion. But for whatever reason, there were a lot of pro-abortion activists at this conference who had latched on to an identity of being a socialist, because that was sort of, the environment was another one as well. So I actually came away fairly optimistic about the young people. They weren't evil. They didn't think Stalin was a good guy. So they just thought the world has problems and the government should do more to solve these problems. I have some reservations about whether the government can or will solve these problems, but more or less they were pretty normal.
I mean, that is one of the issues. We tend, especially people of our generation, to equate communism and socialism, and that's really not the way to look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me look at it this way. We have a graphic I want to show you folks, and the graphic came from your book, Lane, and it's a quote by Abraham Lincoln. So that's graphic number 19. Here's what it says. The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done but cannot do at all, or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. Well, that's one look at the role of government. Now I want to look at graphic 20. A gentleman by the name of Charles Anderson, who's an objectivist, says government is legitimate only to the extent that it protects the exercise of everyone's broad, many, and sovereign individual rights. Such limited purpose government, often called capitalism, is the only government system which allows individuals to make their own moral choices and live their lives in accordance with their choices. Now, Lane, I'm going to ask you to defend what I'm about to tell you because it's on graphic 16 and 17. This came from your book, your new book, about how you're going to fund your program. So let's look at that graphic 16 and then 17. So you're going to increase tax revenues by 10% of GDP, which is about $1.8 or $1.9 trillion a year. You're going to do that by 5% of that, that is half of the 10%, is going to come from a 12% consumption tax called the value-added tax. You're going to have 1.4% come from improved collection of unpaid taxes and reduced use of tax havens, 1% for returning to the 2000, that is the pre-Bush federal income tax rates for taxpayers with incomes below $450,000. You're going to have 0.7% increase for the top 1% by 6 percentage points from 34 to 40%. And then you're going to have 0.3% returning the estate tax exemptions to their 1965 and 75 levels. You're going to add a carbon tax. You're going to add a financial transaction tax of 0.5% on trades, increase the payroll tax by 1%, increase the cap on Social Security payroll so that it covers 90% of total earnings as it did in the early 80s. And you're going to end the real estate tax credit. So, Lane, that is just a wonderful tax increase. Tell us how you justify that, and then tell us politically how you're going to do that, even with Bernie Sanders as president.
Well, I'd be stunned if anything like that happened in a single administration or even a single decade. This is something that's, I think, if it's going to happen, is likely to happen over half a century incrementally. That's the story of the last 100 years in the United States. We get these bursts in expansion of social policy, notably the 1930s and the 1960s. And then in years or decades in between, a little bit happens. Sometimes there's a flurry, and occasionally there's a step backward or backtracking. But for the most part, this is likely to come in fits and starts, one policy at a time. Does it make sense to increase taxation by 10% of GDP? Well, only if you think the programs that you're spending the money on are worthwhile. And again, I think the evidence from our own experience, so part of this is just expanding programs that we already have, and the experience of other rich democratic countries, notably Sweden and Denmark, but others as well, suggests that these do tend to do good things for society. And without the kinds of trade-offs that skeptics often posit. So, for example, they're going to suffer lower economic growth, or reduced happiness, or reduced employment rates. The evidence suggests that those trade-offs, at least at the levels that let's call them the leading countries, Denmark and Sweden, have reached, don't tend to contribute to bad results.
Okay, I'm going to look at graphic number 18, which is the 6 elements of democratic socialism. Democratic capitalism is what you call it, social democratic capitalism. Number 1 element, democracy in the political sphere. I think we had a republic 200 and plus years ago. Capitalism, private ownership of markets, good. Basic education, good quality K-12 schooling, everybody wants that. Expansive, generous public insurance programs, which you're talking about. Employment-oriented public services, early education, affordable colleges, etc. And then modest regulation of product and labor markets. All of those sound fairly modest. And so one last question before we come back here to Jim and Bob Lane. We are set to run this year a one-year deficit again back to the Obama area of $1 trillion. And we're going to do that for the next 4 years. How do you expect a country that can't even balance its budget and has over 100% of debt to GDP today to accept more spending and then to raise more taxes?
So that's a political question, and I'm not a political strategist. So I leave that up to the campaigns of candidates that are proposing to do these types of things. But what I will say is that we have some experience with increasing taxes in recent years. So polls over the last decade or so have shown a steadily rising share of Americans willing to pay more in taxes, of course tending to favor them, especially if they go to the rich, which is a small segment of society that can afford to pay more. But even paying them themselves. And in states like California, so California's a big state, a significant chunk of the country's population, and by the way, about twice the population of all the Nordic countries combined. We've had a number of not just legislative tax increases, but ballot initiatives, including one in 2012 and another in 2016, which voted in new tax increases, especially of K through 12 education. So none of this means that America as a whole is ready to accept massively increased taxes, but it is suggestive that policymakers that advance this as a proposal, it might be accepted. And again, little by little, we might well get to something like Sweden or Denmark.
Lane, I think it's so interesting that you mentioned California, because one of the things here in Dallas is in Texas, we've been able to recruit so many companies who have left California precisely because of the high taxes. And you know, that's just a continuation. That's our best sales pitch that we use. And when you look at the political system right now and it just seems like the American public, Bob, is unwilling to raise taxes, even though we may want some of these services in a utopia.
Right. Well, one of the great myths is that the U.S. has got a small government, and we do if you compare it to Sweden and Denmark, the two countries we keep talking about over and over again. But if you compare us to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Spain, Italy, France even, the government of the United States is not dramatically smaller. In fact, it's actually larger than several of the ones I just mentioned. So we're more or less in the middle of the pack among rich, highly developed nations. There are the social democracies of Northern Europe that do have bigger governments than us, but we're sort of middle of the pack. So, you know, basically the argument that I'm hearing is that we should go from the middle of the pack to the very top with Sweden. But, you know, I don't think it's accurate to depict the United States as some sort of stingy, completely state of nature where people don't get helped if they need help and so forth. The reality is it's much different than that.
Aren't really the two main issues we're concerned about education and healthcare?
Yeah, the two areas the government's most involved in our economy that are the worst, were the ones we're all most unhappy with, right? So.
But when you go and talk to people, what are their major concerns? Those are what they're going to say.
Mostly, yeah. Healthcare, of course, the expense of healthcare is a massively difficult situation in the United States. No one is going to sit on this stage probably and defend the U.S. healthcare system, including myself. It's a bloody mess. It's a bloody mess in part because of in large part because of public policies that the U.S. government has. in the system. But
we have just another minute or two, and let me ask you this. I know you've done a lot of travels research for your book. Is there a country or a system that we might see that might be more applicable or helpful to the United States?
Well, all countries are different. So, you know, my favorite country is Hong Kong. It's got a top tax rate of 15%. It's 15%, not 50, 15. It has the great court systems. There's monetary stability. They have literally zero tariffs, no tariffs at all, complete free trade. And one of the data that I use is how many days it takes to start a business. They estimate it takes 1 day to start a business in Hong Kong, and they say it's 30 days in the United States. So Hong Kong is always my favorite place. And they've gone from being a devastatingly poor, literal starvation at the end of World War II, to now being richer on average than the United States.
And how long does it take to start a business in Denmark?
It's actually about 30 days too. It's not
30
that different. In fact, most of our regulatory measures actually score the Scandinavian countries higher than the United States. It's actually easier to do business on a day-to-day basis, except on tax day. But on just doing business on a regulatory sense, the Scandinavian countries have a lot that the United States could learn from.
Well, now that you know the facts, so to speak, here's your assignment, should you choose to accept it. Do you want more or less of a welfare warfare state? If you want more, then support socialism of any type and more taxes. If you want less, then opt for less government spending and more capitalism. In either case, see if you can solve the problem of $1 trillion a year budget deficits and $22 trillion in federal debt. Check McCuistionTV.com for more economic programs, follow us on Twitter, email, or call us, and always watch as we talk about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at nikkimcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.